Nothing about our move to Mirkwood Drive excited me. I remember how my parents had dropped the news on me last minute, leaving me with a little less than a week to even process it. A strategic move that made me hate them more than I ever thought I could. My dad's new job wanted him right away, they said, and it was a last-minute decision. I wasn't so gullible that I bought that nonsense. I knew that you don't just land a new job and buy a new house all within a week. They could have given me more time. They should have given me more time. Anyway, Mirkwood Drive. I remember how my stomach sank as we pulled into the street and I got the first look at my new home. The house was what my parents called a fixer-upper. It just needs a coat of paint, my father said, with his usual self-assurance, giving his words their own coat of bright, happy paint, trying to make me believe this place was something I'd ever choose. The house looked like it loomed forward to peer down at me, judging me unworthy of its shelter. The grass out front sprung up in uneven, tattered clusters, and it was pockmarked with the ugly patches of dry, barren soil. A dilapidated swing squatted in the corner nearest the home, its frame rusted, and the twine suspending the seat frayed and threatening to snap at any moment. My mom turned and looked at me with bright eyes as the car pulled into the driveway. "Exciting, isn't it?" I kept staring out the window so she wouldn't see my face getting hot and my eyes watering. I opened the door and slid out of my seat as soon as the engine turned off. I shivered for the cold, and my feet sank into the cushions of moss that dwelled on the drive like pustules. The air was bitter with the smell of wood smoke and a fire from somewhere nearby, and I could hear the pinching shrieks of cats fighting up the street. My dog, Sebastian, brushed against my leg as he hopped out of the car and followed a scent trail onto the grass. He stretched his legs and looked at me with eager eyes, bowing his head and spreading his paws to play. At least we'd be getting used to this new house together. The inside of the house was cleaner than I anticipated, but it still smelt damp and felt like it had been abandoned for years. It was just as cold inside as it was out. Dad dug our jackets out of the back of the car. "We just need to get the heating going," he said lightly as he handed me mine. "This place will be toasty in no time." Sebastian came and sat beside me on the bottom step of the staircase, leaning against my leg and watching my parents walk around the room, finding things to celebrate about our new home. He looked up at me in a way that said he wasn't happy either. "Oscar, why don't you look upstairs?" Mum asked me. I shrugged. An empty bedroom isn't the best way to lift your spirits. At last, my despondency sank in, and she looked at me with pity. "Why don't you take Sebastian out for a while? Apparently there's a nice park down the road with some good walking routes." "Oh, it's so convenient here," Dad chipped in. "You can walk to school in no time." Great. It was even closer to the only place I hated more than this. I found Sebastian's things in the car and took him for a walk. Mirkwood Drive was disturbingly quiet. Not just the kind of quiet that's typical for a Sunday morning. I mean, it felt like half of the houses were empty. There was no noise from televisions, no music, nobody tending to their gardens or outside talking to neighbours. A morbid stillness blanketed the world. I shivered, though not for the cold this time, and drew my jacket in closer. The park would have been a disappointment if I had expected anything. It was empty, predictably, a patch of rubbery tarmac with a sodden sandpit and some neglected metal frames with sun-bleached paint peeling off them. A seesaw squeaked in the breeze, and a pair of crows took turns pecking at a food wrapper that someone had left on a bench. I walked on, past the park to the tree line beyond. The crow cocked their heads and peered at me with glassy eyes before they returned to their meal. The grass closer to the tree line was peculiarly short and neat, like it had barely grown. I can't imagine anybody came down this way to maintain it often, and if they did, I couldn't understand why they would focus on one side more than the other. But I suppose I just subconsciously added it to the list of reasons that my new home felt out of place to me. A dirt path had been gouged through the grass, leading up to a wall of sycamore trees that flanked the frontmost face of the woods like a line of cracked, time-worn sentries. Something seemed off, and when a gust of wind forced the grass to bow and rifle through the leaves, I realized what it was. The leaves. It was around early winter that we moved house, and by then, most of the trees had lost their foliage. But this forest was lush and green, and as though it were midsummer. I craned my neck to inspect the canopy with wonder as I passed beneath the branches, and I couldn't spot a single leaf that had so much as a speck of orange or brown. Green, healthy, defiant of the winter chill, frozen in time. My wonder turned to discomfort, and my impressionable young mind started spinning comic book-esque thoughts of barrels of radioactive waste buried deep beneath the soil, their glowing green contents snaking up the root systems and mutating the trees to give them unnatural, everlasting life. What if I got radiation sickness? Or somebody shot us for being on government property whilst trying to cover up the secret? Sebastian barked at a squirrel, and I was yanked out of my daydream with a start. I laughed to myself, watching him circle the tree that his prey had escaped up. It's just a forest, I thought. Don't be stupid. I picked a direction at random and started walking, clicking my tongue to signal my friend to follow. He ploughed through the undergrowth, looking back at me with a wide, open mouth that I, like most dog owners, like to think of as a smile. Maybe this place wouldn't be so bad after all. Dad said the internet connection at the house will be up and running in a couple of days, and I could bring Sebastian here for walks. I could put up with the hermit neighbours. I could get used to this. I heard something nearby, but I couldn't figure out where it came from. It was a kind of satisfied sigh, like the kind that follows a long drink to quench your thirst. I thought that perhaps I just imagined it, but Sebastian had paused, with his paw half raised off the ground, his ears alert as he looked around for its source. I stood still, waiting for it again, but nothing came. I shook it off and continued on our walk, tucking my hands in my pockets as the winter chill deepened. Several minutes later, there was another sound, and this one was no mistake. A deep rumble, punctuated and staccato, seemed to come from several places in the trees above at once. It was like a growl and a laugh rolled into one unnatural sound. It made Sebastian's fur stand on edge, and he responded with his own growl. All of my apprehension came flooding back, and my fear drew the cold deeper into my bones. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the trees. "Come on, boy," I said, my shivering jaw making my words quaver. "Time to go home." I turned, and my breath caught. The dirt path was gone. That was impossible. I had just been following it. In fact, I was still standing on it. I looked down, and then to my left and right, as I realised I now stood at the centre of a junction, the path splitting off to my left, to my right, and onwards behind me, all routes stretching deep into a forest that had inexplicably increased its footprint 100-fold in a single moment. "How in the hell?" I said, looking at my dog as if he could give me an answer. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but I swear he looked puzzled too. Another satisfied sigh, far down the new path to my right. It sounded distant, and yet so incredibly loud and crisp for such a gentle sound, carrying through the air like an arrow sailing through unfettered space. A voice spoke, high and thin, like it was mocking an adoring owner. "This way, doggy." Sebastian snarled and bolted, chasing the source of the voice down the path. I swore and chased after him, desperately calling him back to me. "Sebastian, stop! Stop!" I began bellowing any command I could think of. "Treat, Sebastian! This way! Good boy! Look what I've got here!" It was no good. He was outpacing me further and further every second, and with a defeated whimper, I sank to my knees, my face burning with wind chill. His black and white form kept racing down the path. He jumped a log, weaved through undergrowth, and finally disappeared. I stared at the place I had last seen him, wondering what on earth I could do now. His bark echoed from deep in the trees, and he was gone. I knelt there, staring absently for several long minutes, then got to my feet and began to follow. I had no hope of catching my dog unless he came back, but doing something was better than nothing. I surveyed my surroundings as I walked, and realised then how flat the forest seemed. Apart from occasional saplings or felled logs covered in moss and ivy, there were no features or landmarks, just endless forest in every direction, including the way before me that the dirt path seemed to follow into infinity. Not only that, but there was no bird song. There had been when Sebastian and I first entered. I was sure of it. But it was only now that I noticed it had stopped. "Don't you walk away from me, Oscar Jameson. Come here." I jumped and turned. It was my dad, stood here in the impossible forest with me. He was dressed in his work clothes, a light blue shirt with a salmon tie done up tight around his neck. He was holding something in one hand, beckoning me with the crooked finger of his other. "Dad? What the hell are you doing here?" "Excuse me?" he said sternly, taking a step toward me. "I'm asking the questions." He held up the object, and I recognized it as his old work computer. I thought he threw it out years ago. "Yes or no?" he said, opening it to reveal a cracked screen. "Did you do this?" I gaped at him. Why was he here, quizzing me over an old laptop? It was so out of place. I had to be having the most vivid dream. "No," I told him. He stared at me with such intense anger that I instinctively took a step backwards. "Are you sure?" he said in a tight voice. "Yes, Dad, I'm sure. What are you doing here?" He shook his head sadly. He took the laptop under his arm, turned, and walked off the path. He strode into the forest in a straight line, the same tight, angry expression pulling the skin taut around his jaw. "Dad!" I called after him. "Where are you going? What's going on?" He didn't respond. He just kept walking. A low-hanging tree branch hit him in the face, and he didn't even flinch. He just kept walking until his strength seemed to falter and he stumbled to the ground, collapsing as if falling apart. He didn't get back up. I decided then that I had to be in some kind of insane, lucid dream. So, how would it end? Did I have to die like in most nightmares? I didn't welcome the idea of dying in a dream so clear and realistic, and the thought made me violently shiver. I folded my arms tightly, trying to brace against the shudders. I felt the soft contact of my skin beneath my hands. I wasn't shivering from the dread. I was now shirtless. I looked down at the goosebumps on my arms with trickling nausea. Did I do this to myself? Had I blacked out? Oscar? It was my mom, staring at me with fear and pity. What happened to your shirt? Have you walked home like this? Feeling exposed, shrinking away from the cold, and seeing the concern on the face of this apparition that I couldn't be sure was my mother, it was too much. Hot tears began to stream down my face, nourishing my cheek with some warmth in the bitter cold. What happened? She said again, with more desperation. Tell me. I knew why this moment felt familiar. I was sure it had happened before. Older boys in my school had cornered me after football, calling me a runt and other much worse names. They tore my shirt from me and laughed at my small form and the insubstantial muscles on my arms. It had been a cold winter like this one, and they mimicked my shivering with overdramatic spasms and stuttered their words through chattering teeth. Well, my mother's doppelganger said. I don't remember, I said quietly. Don't lie to me. I'm not. I was angry then. I'll lie to you all I want anyway. I don't know who or what you are, but you're not my mother. A moment of shock, and then the same tight, angry expression on her face that was on my father's. So be it, she said in a strange voice, and then did the same as my dad. She turned, marched into the trees, and collapsed. My clothing returned, but I barely felt warmer. The air felt as though it had grown colder. I heard a clicking sound and a sigh, both sounding like they came from somewhere above where I stood. I searched the trees, and that's when I first saw it. Something squatted in the thick, strong branches of a tree that grew just off the dirt path. It was humanoid, vaguely, but its limbs were long and its bones bulged beneath its overstretched black skin. Long, flaccid fingers wrapped around a branch to keep it balanced, and I thought that it looked like some kind of disgusting crossbreed of a frog and a bat. When it spoke to me, its voice was slow and guttural, like an electronic speaker running on waning batteries. You repeat your mistakes. I stared at it and realized, after several moments of silence, that it was waiting for my response. Is this real? I said, unable to think of anything better to say to the creature. It yelped, in amusement I suppose, and began to climb down the tree. It did so with surprising speed and ease, and when it reached the ground, it almost plopped to the forest floor like a viscous liquid settling. Its movements provoked my nausea, and I watched it gather itself back into its crouching stance before it spoke again. Will you learn? Will I learn what? I asked angrily. Learn or flee? I couldn't look at the being any longer, and I gazed at my feet. Flee. I wasn't sure what choice I'd made, only that I wanted it to end. It made a growling noise and closed the distance between us with frightening speed. Its strangled voice grew even more quiet. So be it. I felt a breeze behind me, and I turned to find the mouth of the forest where Sebastian and I had first entered. The endless forest had shrunk back to its natural boundaries, and even the cold had somewhat subsided. Had I had some kind of fit or attack? Surely I wouldn't be standing here if that was the case. Sebastian was still missing too, and I held his lead in my hand. Maybe he ran back to the house. I looked back into the trees, and there was no sign of him. I called his name and heard nothing back. I'd have to come back and find him later. I dejectedly left the forest, feeling as though I was being watched as I did, and returned to the street. Approaching our house, I noticed the drive was empty. I picked my pace, angry. I couldn't believe my parents had left while I was out. I pounded up the steps and tried the door handle. It jiggled, but the door stayed put. They'd even locked the door behind them, without giving me a key. I hammered on the door with my fist, my eyes blurring. I'd had enough. I'd had enough of the day, and I wanted to curl up on my bed with my dog. But this stupid place had taken everything from me in one fell swoop. I peered through the window, and my breath caught. The house was empty. Worse than empty. It was a wreck. There were none of our boxes, no sign of my parents, not even footprints in the dust and the detritus that covered the floor. Desperate, I crossed the street and picked a house at random. I knocked on the door until a man answered, peering down at me through his glasses. "Can I help you?" he asked reluctantly. "Did you see anybody leave that house?" I pointed across the street, and he followed my gesture. "What, recently?" I nodded, and he laughed incredulously. "No, son. Last time I saw someone leave that place, I wasn't even retired yet. It's been 8 years, I reckon. Sorry." He closed the door before I could ask anything else, and he left me stupefied. Maybe he just didn't notice us move in? Or maybe, somehow, we hadn't anymore. Learn or flee? God, what hadn't I learned? I had never slept outside before. My neck ached, my ribs throbbed, and I felt as though my body had been thrown down a hill. I had managed to salvage some blankets from a recycling bank at the bottom of the street, and having wrapped myself up as best as I could, I drifted in and out of a fitful sleep on the park's cold bench. I woke up once or twice, thinking I could hear Sebastian barking, but when I held my breath and listened, all I heard was the occasional calls of nighttime creatures and the chattering of leaves as the forest waited patiently for me. In the morning, I loitered around the house, but my parents didn't come back. I sat on the grass, and I'm sure I would have earned some questions from my neighbours if any of them had left their houses in the several long hours I sat there trying to decode what happened to me in the previous day. Eventually, with a sickening pinch in my stomach, I surrendered to the knowledge that I had to return to the forest and finish something. My dog was still missing, and my parents, wherever they were, didn't live here, even though all logic and common sense shouldn't have made it so. I came to the wall of sycamores that encircled the forest, and as I passed between them, I could instantly sense I was being watched. I followed the dirt path as I had before, and it wasn't long before it revealed itself to me. "You return," it rattled. It was perched on a branch, its leathery skin twisting as it tilted its head. "My dog," I said. "I want him back." "Then learn." "I won't leave this time," I assured it. "You can't leave this time," it corrected me. "Learn." I looked around again and realized the forest had grown once again to meet the horizon. The creature was gone, and I was alone, at least for a few moments. "Oscar, come here a minute." That voice. It was a voice that made me feel small and powerless, even now, years on. I knew who it belonged to, and despite myself, I faced her. Alice was a little older than me. She had shining brown hair that was always tied in a perfect ponytail. Her teeth were straight. Her nose was a cute little button that shone pink when she flashed a wide smile, and her eyes sparkled when she was amused. She made me feel worthless. And here she was again, beckoning me with a flourish of her slender hand. Her boyfriend stood beside her, alongside her usual entourage. They all looked at me like I was the perfect prey. And I suppose I always had been. "Are you stupid?" She spoke so gently, as if being kind. "Come here, darling." I slowly walked towards her, and as I did, a likeness of my old school built itself around us. It materialized out of thin air, like dust coalescing into the counterfeit scene. The trees of the forest were still all around us. It was like a chunk of the school had been ripped out and placed whole in front of me. "Good boy," she smiled. "Take this." She handed me a phone, placing it into my hand, which was now smaller and softer. I surveyed my body. Whatever was taking me through these forays of my past, it was even changing my physique to suit the illusion, turning me into an effigy of my preteen self. Alice watched my surprise with a raised eyebrow. "You on drugs or something?" She mimicked my surprise, and her hangers-on laughed with her. She gripped my wrist harshly and shook it. "Do you know how to use such an expensive phone?" I nodded dumbly, ashamed of myself. How could somebody that had felt so far away for years suddenly take back all their control from me? She tapped a little beat on the screen with her perfect fingernails. "Open the camera and start recording, sweet." I obeyed. But recording what? Oh, I remembered. There she was, poor Horisha, hugging herself as she trembled like a cornered animal. She had been a quiet girl, and the very few times I spoke to her, she was gentle and nervous. Alice loved gentle and nervous. "What have you been saying about me, Horisha?" Alice always used a calm, almost pleasant voice when she was planning what to do with you, like a cat playing with its catch. "I haven't said anything," Horisha murmured, her voice cracking with fear. What was that? Alice leaned forward and cupped her ear. I can't hear you through that awful accent. Horatia began to cry. This was all happening exactly as it had before, meaning Alice would soon have her fingers wound around clumps of the girl's hair, and Horatia's wobbly tooth would be dislodged by a punch to the face, all of which I would capture for her to share around the school. I was being forced through these events for a second time within the boundaries of this forest. Learn, the creature kept telling me. I stopped recording. Alice's boyfriend noticed and he snatched the phone from me. Oscar isn't even feeling this. He's chickened out. She rounded on me instantly, her smile gone. Do as you're told. I put my hands in my pockets and hung my head. I didn't even have the courage still to answer back directly. I swear that from somewhere deep in the trees, the breeze carried the ghost of a whisper. Good. A murmur of ooh and nervous laughter bubbled from a group, and I knew she was furious. Her quick footsteps pattered on the artificial concrete beneath us. I squeezed my eyes shut, and I braced myself. She grabbed a handful of my hair and forced me to the ground. The first punch was aimed at my nose, and I tried to shake the flares from my vision when the second came, and then the third. I curled up into a ball and tried to protect my face as best I could. The pain was very real, as was the humiliation as I lay there, bombarded by fists and laughter. Finally, and abruptly, it all stopped. The silence was deafening. I unfurled my body, and I was myself again, 16 and laying in the dirt on the forest floor. The school was gone, and my tormentors had vanished. The path still stretched forever in multiple directions, but one route changed. An almost imperceptible light had begun to glow at the path's terminus, and, even from a distance that could have been hundreds of miles away for all I knew by now, it felt warm. I got up and dusted myself off. The pain from my battering hadn't fully faded, and although I was free of blood and bruises, a lingering sting lay in my skin, not allowing me to truly forget. I followed the path that had gained the light, and as I walked, I wondered, had I changed that event, or merely relived it? In reality, I had done as Alice had said all those years ago. I always did as she said. Horatia's embarrassment had driven her away from people even further. But that wasn't my fault, was it? I was only following orders. A stillness shattered. A smash, followed by a torrent of noise like rainfall. I followed the source, and there was a car surrounded by young boys. One of its windows had been broken, and the children looked at one another with their mouths agape. Nearly all of them held stones in their hands. Crap! One of them cried, and he fled. The rest of them copied him, and one caught my shoulder as he ran past me. Oscar, cover for us! They left me stood there, and a man materialized out of nowhere, much like the vision before. He looked furious. He gawked at the car window, then at me. Did you do this? He pointed at my feet, where the stones of the other boys had been dropped. I flexed my finger nervously, and I could feel that I was younger in form again. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Suddenly, everything was gone. I was alone again. Had I passed this test? Wrong. The creature, it squatted on a fallen log, watching me. What do you mean? I said angrily. I was there. Someone had to answer for it. You did not cast a stone. Criminals escaped, and a fool paid the price. But I wrestled with its logic, and although I could understand, it didn't feel fair. You chose ease. Nothing was learned. But I did learn my lesson. I never hung out with those boys again. You robbed them of their lesson. With that, it slunk back into the undergrowth. Learn yours. I learned so many lessons. Many I deserved. Some I still truly think I didn't. I relived what felt like 100 reproductions of my past mistakes, of lessons I had to learn, in what soon became something like an endless fever dream. I learned things about my place in a casual web that I didn't even know existed around me. I answered for the time I left the back door of my uncle's house unlocked and his house was burgled, something my parents must have hidden from me for fear of my guilt. I was too young to know, and only would the most spiteful people in existence truly blame me for such a young and innocent lapse in judgment. But I quickly learned that I was, without prejudice, being made to answer for every single thing. I relived a party I'd gone to only around a year ago, and seeing that, had I stayed and chatted with Selena Roberts for just an hour longer, I'd have been there to spot some unwelcome addition to her drink that had enabled an assault that still woke her up in the dead of night in cold sweats and violent thrashes. How could I have known? The forest didn't care for that. I didn't hunger, nor did I thirst, or tire, or weaken. Hours became days, weeks, and months, until it seemed I had relived my entire life tenfold. After every choice that pleased the forest, I would look for the light, growing ever closer, inch by inch. Eventually, when it was so close that I could feel its prickling warmth on my skin, like blood rushing back to a deadened limb, I approached and reached for the light. Oscar? The light vanished like a switch had been flipped off, and I was stood at the mouth of the forest. My mother faced me in the wood's threshold, and she was looking at me with a half-curious smile. Are you all right? She asked me with a sidelong stare. I took stock of my surroundings. Normal. The trees weren't innumerable. The path followed a route that didn't tangle my brain, and Sebastian stood at my feet, looking up at me innocently and patiently. He was my sign that I was back to reality from wherever I'd been before, and I blunked back warm tears. I didn't know what to say. Delaying the move? Mom finished the sentence for me. Come on, your dad and I have been waiting for you. What move? She laughed at me gently. Are you feeling all right? I don't know. How long have I been here? All her amusement was gone, leaving only concern. Honey? Please, just humor me. She shrugged and wrapped a cardigan closer around her. Oh, I don't know. About an hour? I was stunned. And we're moving. Moving house? Yes, dear. The new job fell through, so your dad got his old job back. But obviously we can't have our old house back. She approached and placed a hand on my forehead. Did you hurt yourself? No, I'm fine, I mumbled. I followed her back to the house, Sebastian in tow, and climbed in amongst the same boxes and cases we'd started unpacking only the previous day. On to another new start. I frequently still wonder if I've been put back into the same reality. Everything seems the same as it ever was, for the most part. But sometimes, old friends and acquaintances let slip the details that give me pause for thought. Apparently, Alice walks with a limp these days, a reminder of the time she pushed somebody a little too far. One of the boys who used to throw stones was the victim of a nasty and messy hit and run, for which the driver was never caught. I don't spend too long asking the questions though, because I've learnt my lesson. I don't want to go back. I promise, I've learnt my lesson.